Hey everybody, and welcome to this week's Tech Talk. So here I have with me today several student mentors. We have Matt, James, and Zekram. You can say hi, everybody.
Hello.
So today we are going to be going over something that kind of came out, or at least was announced in the past couple of days, and that is AI Copilot. Has anyone gotten a chance to take a look at it? Maybe mess around with what have you seen about it?
So it might just be selection bias in a way that everyone's sort of being quite a bit critical about it, but I have not seen it write a single piece of usable code. Most of what I've seen either has critical security flaws or is just in general non-functional or requires extra work to make it functional, which I guess that would sort of be the end goal. But yeah, it's not seeming the best right now, but I'm guessing that will be tweaked as everything continues.
Yeah, maybe this is following in the that general motto of move fast and break things. It doesn't need to work. It doesn't need to work out the gates. It just needs to be first.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so AI Copilot is something that's definitely clearly been in the works for a while, um, and it works off of GitHub. So before we get into what AI Copilot is and why people are maybe uneasy about it, let's talk about what GitHub is. So I have a GitHub shown up here. GitHub is essentially where people can upload their code, work on it, share it with others. It's a way to manage all of your files and repositories. The one I have up on the screen just happens to be someone who develops a lot for OBS, which is what I'm using to stream. I'm not showing mine because mine's wildly boring and empty. I use it just to mostly see others, but you can see here there's all these different commits, people collaborate. You have these huge open source projects, and essentially what AI Copilot is it is an AI that has, you could argue, learned how to code by learning from the code everyone else writes. So GitHub is a massive, massive international repository of all different code bases, from the tiniest little chips to distributed networks, and it's just a ton to learn from. And that's essentially what AI Copilot has done. It's a piece of software that has learned how to code from everybody else's code. And there's several questions about that, which are, does it work? How well does it work? Is it ethical? Do people like it? Is it going to be useful? How can it be used, etc.? So does how does everyone else use GitHub?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
use GitHub.
occasionally.
Yeah. So we all have a GitHub. We all have at least something uploaded to it. And who's uploaded open source projects? Nobody?
Uh, so
Uh,
a little bit arguable because the one open source thing I do know I have up is a like a collaboration from my robotics team,
okay.
which that's like the program that I do it through requires you to have your source your code open source if you want to reuse it year to year. But
Yeah.
other than that, mostly private projects.
Yeah. So before we get into some of the other topics, it's important to talk about kind of this idea of open source versus closed source code. So closed source code is probably something that people are intuitively familiar with. So um, if you program something, you can create that as a tool, as a piece of code inside, a robot. You just mentioned robotics, and you have some. It's private. People aren't intended to use it. People aren't intended to see inside it. They're just supposed to use it as a tool. They can't modify it and use it as their own. This is in comparison to open source code. So open source code has a lot of utility to it. Open source code can be shared with others so that they can edit it. You can create open source projects and reveal the code behind it so people know that, for example, it's not spying on you. There's all sorts of open source projects out there. Zekrom, I think you are a fan of one absolutely massive open source project, are you not?
I am a big fan of
And
one
could you
giant
say what that is?
Linux.
Linux, yes. So Linux, the world's most popular operating system, is an open source project. And yes, some people may be tilting their heads at that because obviously, what about Windows? So yes, if you're talking about personal computers, Windows, certainly. If you're talking about servers, aka the computers that websites exist on, it's all Linux. Even Microsoft uses Linux as the operating system for many of their servers. So Linux is an operating system that was created as an open source project. It's not created by one person. It's created by a whole team of people working distributedly around the globe. And even a lot of the features you find on operating systems like Mac OS and Windows were first created in Linux, and then they took those ideas and added them into Windows or Mac. But the entire premise behind open source code is there's a variety of different licenses. So you can share your code so that people can reuse it freely. You can share your code so that people can use it for non-commercial purposes, as in they can also create open source projects, or they could at least create their own projects, but they can't profit off of it. There's a whole variety of licenses out there, and a lot of people are maybe a little not happy to find that some of their projects that they intend for other people to use are being used by another, but by not a person, but an AI.
On that note, like I found a tweet from someone who's been experimenting with the licenses, because this was sort of what tipped off a lot of people at first. The Copilot program can actually generate licenses word for word, which sort of tipped off a lot of people because it's supposed to not be able to make verbatim replications of code. But someone was just playing around having it generate as many licenses as they could get, and they managed to get licenses from like the Department of Energy. They managed to get licenses from like popular games, like I believe the one up now is Quake. And that sort of tipped people off that it may be using code that isn't necessarily licensed for commercial or even just general like project use.
Yeah, and while anecdote isn't data, this hasn't been out too long, and so we don't really have data, but there is quite a bit of anecdote in a short period of time. So we'll see what the future holds when people start actually looking at this. But I think this person, if I'm not mistaken, is the creator of Flask. Yep. So this is the creator of Flask. That's like that's a way to develop websites using Python. And yeah, you see here that he's trying to get it to write some code for him, and it's not quite generating the correct licenses. So that's kind of a little bit of also of an insight into how this works. So there's predictive text that's built into a lot of editors, and very often it might be something as simple as, if you start typing doc, it knows that you want to type document, and it might just suggest some of these things. But suggestion is different from typing it out for you, and it seems like AI Copilot generates code based on comments, and so I actually, when I first heard that, I thought there's no way that they were able to do this because what programmer writes good comments? I don't know about you guys, but I almost never see it. Um, People write the code, and once it works, once they figured it out, they don't want to go back and explain themselves it works.
Yeah.
So
It's
go ahead.
interesting that you said that there, though, like you don't see this anywhere else. But I actually noticed earlier this year that Google Docs does something slightly similar, not nearly to the level that this is, with recommending your next word.
Hmm.
So it will actually put up like a transparent, like, I think this is what you're going to say next, and you can just tab over to say yeah. The difference, though, is that, and this is where it gets into like the morality. Google Docs uses your own documents to create those suggestions. So if I type like GitHub Copilot 100 times into a document, and then go to a different one and type GitHub, it's going to recommend Copilot. Whereas this is using data from the entirety of GitHub.
Yeah. Yeah, it's different when it learns from yourself. Like with your phone, you might have like weird abbreviations that you use, or you might have like, a proper noun that isn't recognized as a word, but you use it all the time. Maybe it's like your street address or something or whatever, and you text it to your friends, um, and your phone realizes, oh, okay, they really want that word, must be something relevant to them, and then it doesn't autocorrect it. Um, Most people don't have a problem with that. They have a problem with all of a sudden other people are able to see, for example, what that word was that that person likes to use, or in this case, that a tool is built using that information. Um, yeah, so a lot that it does bring in this big ethical question of I released this code under the premise that someone else could use it and develop with it freely, but I didn't say that something else, a piece of software could do that. And it kind of, now we start to get into this whole new realm of, it's fine if another person does, and it's, maybe that person, let's say they use web scraping in order to pull your code from the internet, and they just did something very basic with it. And like, arguably, that's still the person controlling it, but at what point does that person's program that they use to pull that information, um, at what point do you consider it an AI? Obviously, AI requires much more than just pulling the information. That's just the first step. But it's this kind of territory where for decades we've talked about what if, and we're now starting to get more at that edge. And how do we consider it? Do you just consider the AI just another piece of code? Um, Arguably, some pieces, if it's just as simple as like, do you type this word in your phone a lot, therefore you must like it. That's a lot different from what this is. And you could kind of see like, you know, what do we freak out about? What are we concerned about? And what are we not? And that's kind of where we're at. Do we want, is this going to be our first step towards a potential Skynet, or is this just harmless? Skynet obviously being a throwback to the Terminator, but and not to fearmonger on that point, but it is a reason to be concerned of this tool. Um, but that's a lot of the negative side of it. There could also be a lot of useful parts to this too, right?
Absolutely. In my opinion, if it got refined to the point where it didn't write dangerous code, because it has, um, it could be used almost everywhere. It could increase the productivity of um, a programmer who's trying to get through like I don't know, you have 1,000 lines of code to write and a deadline, like it could be extremely helpful. It could especially be helpful for like if if you imagine a project where you you've got a lot of code that probably exists elsewhere or is probably similar, like generic code. So I think one example of it was like processing like usernames and passwords. There are safe ways to do that that have been sort of standardized, and you can generate those safe methods just with a comment and letting it do the work for you.
Yeah, and this might seem so obviously you can use AI Copilot to generate code much more quickly, like you know how it works, but um, instead of typing it all, it can kind of figure it out for you with just a little bit of a description. Um, this is kind of a little bit of a silly comment, but I guess real. But if AI Copilot is generating code from comments, then maybe we see code coming out that has good comments because that's what they started out with. Maybe. Um, so yeah, these are all definite positives. But as you mentioned before, um, we have issues like you mentioned where there could be potentially some dangerous code, like this tweet right here. We mentioned before that it's generating licenses, but there was a license generated from the U.S. Department of Energy, and you know how to that's kind of a concern if all of a sudden the Department of Energy has um, a tool writing code based on what it wrote. I mean, there's a whole lot to be inspected on that. You know, who knows where to begin, but clearly that's indicative that it's getting its code, it's looking at code bases from a very, very wide array of people.
Mm-hmm. I think in relation to like the dangerous code aspect, beyond just like getting code from places that you really wouldn't want it to get code from, like a government agency, um, there are examples. Someone did a security sort of audit on the program and have examples where it's basically creating like extremely common flaws, like SQL injection attacks, which were literally the bane of the 2000s. Like that was the classic security flaw where someone could insert code by just adding pretty much a semicolon um, into any like user input, but someone generated um, just code with GitHub Copilot that had a SQL injection vulnerability in it, something that should not exist at this point because it's such a common vulnerability.
Yeah, and that's a good point. A lot of people, when they're getting started learning how to code, they'll follow a tutorial, they'll jump into GitHub, maybe it's an online course, and they might make mistakes. They might have simple things like that, and or you know they have all these common different um, ways that they write code, which yeah it works, but it's great for learning, not great for producing actual tools that people use. A common thing people learn how once they start learning how to use databases and stacks. They'll start storing passwords, but they're not storing them encrypted, and that's when like it seems very silly not to store an encrypted password where people could just look at if they get into your database, see everyone's password and username. But we've had like these massive companies, like international companies, get hacked where they store their users' passwords completely unencrypted. And you could imagine maybe people are relying on this tool, and the more they rely on it, the more they're unfamiliar with how the code they're writing works. And you have these people who can do a lot really quick, but they don't really understand it, and they don't understand the security flaws that are being generated from it. It's definitely a concern that
And
it's a concern to have.
related to like the don't understand the security flaws, not only do you not understand them, but you are liable for them because GitHub has made it very clear in their frequently asked questions that all the code that it creates becomes your code. So some people would look at that and say, oh, okay, so that makes sense. Like it creates code, and that's actually really generous. So you don't have to attribute GitHub Copilot. It just becomes yours. But like people have been saying, not only with licenses where that could cause a mess, like you're then infringing on someone's license, but it could also possibly make you liable for like insecure code, which could be a whole mess. And it isn't Copilot's fault, it's yours because you didn't look it over well enough. But then when you combine that with like people who aren't exactly like experienced with what they're doing and they're letting Copilot just generate it for them, it could create a massive mess.
Yeah, so that and there's all these problems. There's all these other issues that are a part of the current debates and conversations regarding AI that plays into this. And yeah, who is responsible? Who bears the risk is a question that is probably going to be asked a lot that we haven't solved yet. Just last week, we were talking about facial recognition and how there could be built-in bias depending on who it is that created, who trained that data set and what they trained that data set with. Well, all of that can be rolled into this AI that's now writing code, and the same exact thing can happen where the code, maybe like there's bad code, maybe it has bias, maybe it has security flaws, and it writes code. That code gets contributed to GitHub where AI Copilot learns from it, and it has this like recursive mistakes, recursive bias that just self-propagates. Maybe they have a failsafe for it, but you know, I would not assume they would unless they have stated it, and I haven't seen it myself.
Now they did, just to touch on that point, they are claiming that they're developing tools that should help you identify if GitHub Copilot has directly verbatim copied a piece of licensed code that isn't licensed for just use like that. But I still do not believe that that's enough. It shouldn't be using that code in the first place. But related to like yes, it's a powerful tool, but in some ways, I wonder what the usage of this tool, like there is no restrictions for its usage. So when you're learning how to code, I wonder if someday, rather than properly learning what everything does, you'll just go on Copilot and plug in comments to make code. Like, I don't think we're getting farther and farther away from the base tools that run our machinery, our computers. And I think this is almost another step further away. And
yeah,
then
go on.
And then not even from an overall technology point of view, but think about like a teacher, a college professor who is having their students write code, trying to educate them on how those underlying systems work. But how can they tell the difference between their student being a good student, learning how the code works, making the code, or plugging in a comment on GitHub Copilot?
Or companies, for that matter. If one of their employees is not, assuming a programming employer, if they're just using Copilot to write the code that they should be creating themselves, then the company should have hired the Copilot instead of the actual employee.
Well, I mean, the code generated by Copilot is not really cohesive enough to be like, used by itself without being perfected or, changed so it can work by a programmer, at least at this
now.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like at the time that they actually, like, this goes out of like what do they call it? The technical preview. By the time they actually start selling it to the companies, like the software, I think it's these like errors are going to be definitely greatly reduced.
Go ahead.
No, you can go. Sorry.
I was looking up a picture. So just going back to something just said a second ago, It's kind of the general idea of, is a tool a supplement to you, or is it a replacement of you? Like, does this tool enable you to do more, or is this tool doing it for you? And it just makes me think about the movie WALL-E. And is this our future? Like I don't think we're gonna have flying seats anytime soon. That just seems like a huge risk. But self-driving cars exist. People have Teslas. You're not really supposed to use it, but people do. Is this the future of code? Like, they're just watching TV, but who knows? Maybe they're on GitHub. Maybe they're using AI Copilot as their Copilot. That's kind of just a fun play on words, but you know, it does come down to, is this going to be a smart tool that people use, or is it going to be what was described before, where people really don't understand what it is they're using, and there is danger behind it using. Like every tool, like even as simple as a hammer, it has a danger to it. You need to know how to use it. A hammer is a pretty simple tool. You know, the risks there are pretty evident, but as tools get more complex, do you know what it is you're working with?
So touching on one thing that I believe Matt said before, the idea that this tool will be sold to companies. So this sort of goes back to, I believe, last week's Tech Talk. We talked about facial recognition and the idea that publicly available photos could be used to train AIs, and how, like, the morality of that. So that's sort of the same situation here, where we have publicly available code being used to create a commercial product. In fact, a lot of that publicly available code is restricted under licenses that say that it can only be used in publicly available open source projects. So what's the morality of that? Is it a breach of user trust for all the people who trusted GitHub to host their open source projects to suddenly come in and say, okay, all your open source projects are mine for training data to create a commercial product?
Exactly. How does the license work through that whole chain of creation, where in the past, you create it, another person grabs it, and they create with it. It was very simple. Now it's, you create it, and AI looks at it, learns from it, and then a whole variety of people use that to create something. And then does the license extend to those people? Does it extend to the people who wrote the AI? How is the AI treated like a regular piece of software? Is it okay to charge money for the AI that learned? Like, you can't charge money for if you fork a project and that project has free use, a non-commercial free use, you can't charge money for that for anything created from that project. But can an AI trained on that be charged? Can you charge money for that as a service? It's hard to say. We don't know where this is. It's the beginning of it. It could be a tool that could be very beneficial, but as with anything, it's new, and we don't know the risks that could come about. And I guess that's something that we'll have to keep an eye out for the future to learn.